Hi there. Sorry about that. My internet connection failed me and ended up ending my stream. So I'm having to start my stream. Well, so we will pick up where we left off. We are talking about King David and the example that we are studying here about his temptation of the lust of the eyes. Again, we're in lesson 12, and this is part one or part two of part one. Because my internet connection was poor. Like I said, we've been having a lot of internet issues in my neighborhood this past week, and unfortunately, it disconnected me. And so I am so sorry about that. What can you do? Technology is always a mystery in some situations. Anyway, as I said, we're going to pick up with King David, the example that we are studying here, and what to avoid in this situation with spiritual nearsightedness. That's on page 87 of your workbook if you have that available. We were looking in 2 Samuel chapter 11, where David sends Uriah, or sends for him. Uriah comes home, and he hopes to get Uriah to spend some time with Bathsheba so that the baby can be supposed to be the father rather than David. So he's trying to cover up what he did. He doesn't want it to be known that what he did, because remember, he did this in the middle of the night where he called for Bathsheba. So very few people would probably have been aware of their evening together. If it were servants of David, he could keep them, make them keep quiet. So he's trying to keep this thing from being known throughout Jerusalem. As I said, Uriah refuses to go home, claiming that he simply cannot do that with his men out in the battlefield. He would not feel right about it. So eventually, David has to send him back into the battlefield. So he has to come up with a new plan. Okay, what am I going to do next? So you can see the progression of the sin here, where he starts out by lusting after a married woman. When he found out she was married, that should have been the end of it. His decision-making process should have said, okay, she's off limits. Unfortunately, the lust was so great and he allowed it to become powerful, for he wanted that sexual immediate gratification. They commit adultery together. Then she becomes pregnant, which was not expected probably. And now he has to figure out a way to get Uriah to appear to be the father of the baby. When Uriah refuses to cooperate, of course, Uriah knows nothing about what's happened. He doesn't understand. He's just trying to be an obedient soldier to the king. So Uriah goes back into battle, and he calls his commander, Joab, David's commander, and gives him orders. I want you to send Uriah into the thickest and hottest part of the battle, because he wants Uriah to be killed. He knows that if he sends Uriah into that portion of the battle, his chances of survival are very slim. And so he was hoping that Uriah would be killed. So now we're plotting murder. He's orchestrating the murder of someone so that he can then claim to be the father of the child Bathsheba's pregnant with, rather than admitting what he had done. So, as we know, Uriah does go where he's told. He's an obedient servant of the king, and he is killed in battle. And when David receives word that Uriah has been killed, then he knows, aha, I have successfully covered up what I did. Now no one will ever know. He waits for a certain amount of mourning time. This is in chapter 2 Samuel 11, verse 26. When the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she mourned for her husband. And when her mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. So as I said, David thinks he's covered successfully what he did. Yes, Bathsheba's pregnant, but not showing yet. They wait for the mourning period to pass, because that would have looked suspicious. And he makes her and claims her as his wife. You know that kings normally had multiple wives. David already has wives, but he adds Bathsheba to his company of wives, and she has a son. So it's supposed to be assumed by all that the baby is David's. However, David forgot a very important thing. God knew what he had done. He had not covered up what he had done from God. God was well aware of what David had done. And the progression from the beginning of the lust of the eyes and where it led him to lying, covering up, deceiving, and then orchestrating the murder of her husband. So this is the progression that sin can take us sometimes. When we get caught up and we make a bad decision and we realize there's going to be consequences to face, but we want to hide what we did, then we have to start committing more sins after that in order to cover up what we did. And we think we're going to be able to do that. But that's worldly wisdom for you. We think we're going to be able to fool God and keep God from seeing what happened. And of course, David is going to find out that that is not going to happen. The power of temptation, again, as I said earlier, must never be underestimated. It can have a strong effect on us, which is why continuing to build and strengthen our faith is so important, so that when those times come, our faith will be strong enough to reject the temptation. David could have stopped. He could have stopped in a number of places in this sin. Number one, he could have stopped when he found out she was married. Number two, when he found out she was pregnant, he could have owned up to what he did and taken accountability, and then confessed what he did, and all of those things. And it would have been uncomfortable and it would have been difficult, absolutely. But he had opportunities to do that. So his consequences, therefore, are going to be very severe because what he did was very severe. This sin led to murder. Uriah being a completely innocent victim in this, he is killed and has no idea what in the world happened. All right, so Nathan the prophet in 2 Samuel chapter 12 is sent to David by God with a message. And Nathan explains to David that you have created or committed a terrible sin. He uses a parable to help David understand what he's done. And immediately David makes the statement in verse 7 where Nathan says to David, "You are the man. Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul, and I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your keeping, and gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if that had been too little, I also would have given you much more." So he reminds David of all the blessings that God had granted him. And you didn't even appreciate any of them. You threw them all away for one moment of fulfilling a lustful desire. So he is going to have a series of consequences. The first consequence is going to be the baby that's born is going to become sick and will eventually die. So he's going to lose that child. Secondly, there will always be adversity in the household of David. Within his family members, there will always be adversity, chaos, and trials. We know that among his children, he had multiple problems. We have Absalom, who tried to usurp the throne. We have his other son, Ammon, who had incest with his sister Tamar. We have Absalom killing Ammon later, in retribution. He has all kinds of other problems with his family members because of this. This was part of his consequence. And then his wives were going to be defiled by other men on the rooftop of his home in the daytime, so everyone would know that his wives had been violated. Normally, when this happens, the women are then put away. They're no longer, the king no longer sleeps with them because they have been violated by other men. So David had a huge loss here, huge loss. But he does immediately do what he's supposed to do at this point in time. When he is convicted of his sin, he admits it in verse 13. So David says to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die. So he's not going to kill him or put him to death, but he's going to have to live through years of consequences, regret, and all kinds of sorrow that will be brought upon him. The loss of more children, the turmoil in his family. It won't make his life easy, that's for sure. And each time something like this happens, it's going to bring back the memory of what he did and make him remember this is happening because of what I did. Now, not only were his consequences severe for David, but they also affected other people here. Other people were drawn into his consequences. Bathsheba, for one, Uriah, and his family, which had nothing to do with the decision that David made, yet they were unfortunately caught up in the consequences. This also can happen to us when we make terrible decisions and choices. We not only bring consequences on ourselves and misery and sorrow and regret, but unfortunately, it also affects other people. And of course, our influence and example is penetrated or contaminated. So these are all things that we need to keep in mind before we make decisions, before we give in. You know, it's foolish to think that no one will ever find out. That's usually the first mistake we make when we are making the decision to commit a sin, is we think it's going to be something we can keep secret. But what we forget is that God knows all and sees all, and there's no way we're going to keep that secret. And eventually, in the day of judgment, we will stand before him and answer for it if we have not repented of it before then. In Matthew chapter 5, when Jesus was here on earth teaching the people, he gave some very wise counsel about this situation that David faced. In chapter 5, we want to start reading in verse 27. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. This is what David was guilty of. He looked on the woman. He stared at her. He watched her. As soon as he realized a woman was bathing, he should have immediately looked away and removed himself from that area, gone back in the house, whatever. But he didn't. He lingered. And the longer he lingered and the longer he thought about it, the greater the temptation came for him. Instead of immediately getting away from whatever the lust of the eyes was. And this can be any number of things that the lust of the eyes can involve us in, as we are going to go on and talk about now. So the application for us from this example of David, probably the most important, is that whatever sin we've committed, however grave it may be, forgiveness is always available, but we have to take accountability and responsibility for what we've done. David took accountability and he suffered the consequences because he knew that was what God wanted. So there's always the gift of forgiveness available to us. And as Nathan told David that God would not remember the sin against him any longer, we know that God does not hold that in his memory. But we have to be willing to confess, repent, and take accountability, whatever the consequences might bring us. We have to understand the power of the lust of the eyes and how, if we linger in that, it can lead us into sin, even though we might be arrogant enough to think that it would never happen to us. If we allow ourselves to stare at it or keep looking at it, or keep longing after it, it weakens us little by little, and we underestimate the power, and then we usually get caught up in that. We have control over what we look at, over what we see. And like I said, as soon as he noticed a woman bathing, that should have been the first thing he did was turn away and go back in the house and get away from the area. He should have respected her privacy and realized that he had no right to be looking at her, but he doesn't. He thinks about it. He lingers. He asks questions about her. He's inquiring after her. And so the more thought that he gave it, the weaker he became against the temptation. But we have to be conscious of the choices we make. We have to make a commitment to ourselves that we're not going to commit sexual sins, or we're not going to allow ourselves to be drawn into sin by the lust of the eyes. Job made a covenant with his eyes he tells us about it over in Job chapter 31. So let's see what we can learn from the wisdom of Job here. Job chapter 31, we want to read verse 1, where Job says, I have made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a young woman? You have to make a conscious decision. You're not going to allow yourself to be drawn into a sexual enticement or seduction. It has to be a conscious thought you make. It can't be something that you leave to chance, or like I said, in arrogance think, I'd never do that. We must be prepared, which is why we work hard to build our faith in self-control so that we don't allow our control to get out of our hands. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul also gives us a good remedy to this situation. 2 Corinthians 10, and let's look at verses 3 through 5. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. This is what we need to do. Like I said, as soon as David saw what he saw, that should have been the end of it. He should have brought his thoughts and his eyes under the obedience of God, knowing that this was not something that God wanted him to be involved in. So we must make it a conscious effort, a commitment that we make to God and we make between ourselves and God, that we're never, ever going to allow this to happen. So we avoid situations where we could be tempted. We avoid environments where we might be tempted. This is what the wise person does. They know better than to spend time alone with another woman they're not married to. They need to be careful with intimacy. They need to be careful of what they look at as far as immodest dress and pornography is concerned. All of those things are sinful things we do with our eyes that can lead us then into temptation. So we must avoid them. We must see them as sin when we are, if we do by any chance happen to look at them. We know that pornography is forever present on the internet. We also know that in movies, they show a lot of sexual behaviors and activities in movies. And there are all kinds of images available almost everywhere that have sexual content that can lead our thoughts in the wrong direction. So we avoid them. We do not spend time looking at them. We get away from them. We draw near to God. We remember the commitment that we made about staying away from those things. Our author mentions other things that the lust of the eyes can lead us into. A lottery sign can arouse jealousy, covetousness. If we think, wow, if I could win the lottery, look at all the stuff I could buy, all the places I could go, all the things I could do if I won the lottery. And so we become covetous minded in thinking about, okay, well, if I win a $10 million lottery, I can do, oh my goodness. And then the list would go on, and then our mind goes on and on and on, and we get caught up then in covetousness. So we have to beware. If that's something that we have a weakness for, stay away from it. beer commercials, alcohol commercials. If you have a weakness in this area, if you are a recovering alcoholic or whatever it may be, if you have a weakness for alcohol, obviously watching commercials where people are drinking and enjoying it and so on can lead you to lusting after, involving yourself in that sort of thing. So we all, again, have to be aware of our weaknesses. And then when we see things that bring those thoughts to mind, we immediately dismiss them. We get away from them. We avoid those places where we might be tempted. We don't go to bars, obviously. We don't hang around with people who drink. We would not involve ourselves in buying lottery tickets and then dreaming about or thinking about fantasizing about what we would do if we did win the lottery. Most people say, hey, if I win the lottery, I'm going to give a lot of money to charity. Yeah, that sounds good, but that doesn't always happen because the greed takes over in some cases. Now, if we set our eyes on the things that will keep our mind on good things, this is a good practice to put into. And in Philippians chapter 4, Paul lists a series of things that we are to think on and keep our minds and our vision on, and it will help us to avoid temptations and sinful things. In verse 8 of Philippians 4, he says, finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue, or if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. This is where our mind should be focused, not on sitting around and fantasizing about what other things we might get involved in that are sinful, and then trying to convince ourselves that no one will ever know, because that is a trap that Satan lays at our feet. And if we allow ourselves to fall into that trap, then we are going to suffer, in some cases, very severe consequences, not only for ourselves, but other people that we're close to. So that is as far as we got on our lesson on Thursday. So we will go stop here then, and we will finish the lesson in our next presentation. It is my plan, Lord willing, that we will go over the example of King Rehoboam and his what happened to him when he allowed the pride of life to overtake his thinking. And then we're going to look at Jesus's example, which he is the best example of avoiding temptations. And then we'll get into our questions. So it is my hope that we will get all of that done in the next presentation and in our next class. And then that will leave lesson 13 for the remainder, the last 2 weeks of our study. So we are, as I said, nearing the end, and I hope you have found this study to be helpful to you and beneficial and help you to strengthen your faith, because that's certainly the purpose of Bible study. We continue to emphasize the importance of Bible study. We cannot underemphasize it, because when we stay connected to God through Bible study, through worship, through prayer, through association with other brethren, this is part of how we keep our faith strong. And therefore, when temptation does come knocking, we will be able to resist. All right, again, I thank you for watching. I apologize for our mess up with our internet. We'll blame that on Spectrum, which is my internet provider. And like I said, this past week, we have had a lot of interruptions in internet service for whatever reason. And I'm hoping that those don't continue. So again, I thank you for watching, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.